This is Rabbi Jeff Sachs of Atid and WebYeshiva with another installment in our series on the history and mechanics of Torah She-Baal, looking at the Rambam's Hakdama L'Perush HaMishna. Last week we began this sixth section, the sixth chapter of the Rambam's introduction to the Mishna, and we noticed that it was really, it seemed there's something odd about it. We sensed a sudden drastic change in what the Rambam was talking about. Can anyone summarize for us what we talked about last week?
No.
No? There's got to be somebody that can summarize for us what we were discussing last week. No, someone, anyone? This is being recorded for posterity, so it's really quite embarrassing. Okay. So I'll tell you what it is that we were talking about. But I'll also tell you that if from week to week you don't remember what it is that we're learning, so you know that means there's something wrong. And you should somehow make a point of reviewing what we study. You can do that by listening to the archives. You can do that by taking notes in the right here on the right-hand panel. There's a notes section where you can write notes as we go along, and it gets saved privately on your. Unlike the chat goes to everyone. The notes is private. It's just on your computer. Nobody sees it. I don't see it. No one else sees it. Or you should do something to keep in mind what it is that we're learning from week to week. You're making an investment of time and even of money. And if you want to grow in your learning, really, that's quite necessary. Last week, the Rambam started this discussion based on a philosophical point about the purpose of it all. I think I entitled the class. Is that the nature of the purpose of man, of mankind, that is different than the discussion about the purposes of commercial items. We talked about, a hammer and a saw and other things like that. Is this at all familiar to you? Okay. And then he was discussing this question of, again, in the context of these purposes, התחייב שנחקור גם כן למה נמצא האדם ומה תכליתו. So it's only a kind of natural philosophical or intellectual progression to ask, a large question: what is the purpose of man? Pardon the gendered language. What are we doing here? Why has God placed us here? What is our purpose? I'll skip ahead to where we left off. Here. And the Rambam goes on to say, and I left you with a question: what in the world is this discussion doing here? This is a discussion which is parallel. This is a discussion that's parallel to material that the Rambam writes about in his Shmona Prakim, his work by the title the 8 chapters. It's parallel to material in the Moreh Nevuchim. What is it doing here in his discussion of Torah She-Baal? Until now, he's been describing the history and development of what happened in the moment Moshe came down from the mountain. What is this discussion doing here? Would anyone have a moment to consider that? Does anyone have any thoughts on that question? No? Okay, Taylor, I'm going to unmute you. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we're here for a purpose, that purpose is defined in the Torah. That would be a connection why the two are put together. I'm not understanding your question.
Okay, no, in other words, I think that's correct, but there may be more to it than that. It's true that our purpose and the Torah are connected, but the Rambam's been describing like the mechanics of, like, why here? Why in this point in the discussion? He's been talking about like how halakha works, how Chazal learned things out from drashot, how we count the mitzvot up to 613, you know, a variety of topics. What is this doing? I think you're on the right track, but I think that I think we can sharpen it a bit. Esther, I'll unmute you in a second.
Unmute her now.
Okay. Okay, Esther, you have the mic.
Okay. Okay. How does man fit into this world of the Torah?
Okay, into which world of the Torah? What do you mean by that?
What is man's purpose in life? And the Torah gives you what should you say? A way of life, and it's no good just having a way of life. You have to have somebody who performs in this way of life, and that's where man fits in.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get my meaning?
Okay. Yeah, I do. I think you're expanding on what Tilalea was saying.
Okay.
In other words, you're both approaching the question from the point of view of the person. So what's really the departure point of, it's true that the Rambam here is asking the question, what's the purpose of man? But it's possible, so Tilalei, I think in your comment, in the chat comment, I think you said a little sharper. You say, it's well and good to tell us how to accomplish purpose, but still need to know what it is. So I think that's the point. In other words, the question is not so much, even though the Rambam phrases it this way here, what is the purpose of man? But in the context of the nature of the Torah is really, good, even better. The question of why God created us. So it needs to connect man and God together. And what's that connection?
Connection is the Torah.
The connection is the Torah. Right, so the question is not, even though it's phrased as a discussion of what is the purpose of man, the question really is, what is the purpose of Torah and the relationship between the two, between people and the Torah. So the Rambam now gets on to this larger, so that's why the Rambam places it here in this context of the Torah. So as we know that the Torah was given by Hashem at Har Sinai, and we know how it got from point A to point B to point C to point D. And the Rambam now pauses here to tell you that this is not some mere abstract, historical discussion, but it's got meaning, it's got teeth, it's got message for us today in the 12th century, for us today in the 21st century. V'hinei hitbarer me'elu ha'akdamot ki tachlit olamenu. It's clear, he says, from all this introductory, this prefatory material, that the purpose of our world is ish chacham v'tov, that we are trying to be and trying to become wise and good people. Now, these are not some abstract slogans, but a very concrete, programmatic notion, which the Rambam is going to explain. And you'll see that he pulls the whole conversation around, brings it around 360 degrees from a very concrete historical philosophical discussion to a much more abstract theoretical discussion, and it's going to get pulled back to a very concrete notion. For the Rambam, the interplay of philosophy and ideas on one side with normative behavior and action on the other is always very a very tight connection, and you'll see it demonstrated here in about a moment. Let me just read the chat.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, that's true. I'm not sure how it fits in here. But kasher yitzlachu, Esther, I'm just gonna mute you for a second. וכאשר יצלחו ביד איש מן המין האנושי החוכמה והמעשה, ברצוני לומר בחוכמה ציור האמיתות כמות שהן. So he has to describe these two things, what chokhmah and tov are, or chokhmah and maaseh are. Chokhmah, wisdom, maaseh, action. What does he mean by chokhmah, by wisdom? Tziyur ha'amitot kimot shehem. A kind of grasping of truth, of first principles as they are. Hasagat kol ma she'efshar she'yasigehu ha'adam. And the ability to grasp all that is humanly graspable. Everything that we can understand, there should be nothing that can be comprehended which is foreign to us, which is unobtained by us, or unobtainable. Uva ma'aseh, and what do we mean by action? Yosher hamezek. What we might say is more a sense of here he's talking about like equanimity of purpose, but it's a kind of moral rectitude. The dvarim hativiyim, the harchakat ha'hitmakrut, v'shelo yikach mehem ela ma sheyesh bo kiyum haguf. A kind of not asceticism, but a notion of self-control, of balance, of izun, that in our he's describing these two parallel realms. The inner intellectual realm, what he calls chokhmah, versus the physical realm, recognizing that we mankind, are this very paradoxical synthesis of the divine, the spiritual, and the physical animal. So a notion that we don't let the physical component of our lives overcome us, that we have to live a life of balance, v'hatavat hamidot kulan, and that the relationship between the degree to which we can rein in our physical side is connected to the degree to which we can perfect our personalities, what the Rambam calls midot. The Rambam here calls midot. Harei ish asher ze yeh matzavo hu hatachlit. That is the purpose. A kind of balancing act. The Rambam in Hilchot Deot describes, in a slightly different context, the Rambam in Hilchot Deot describes the kind of work, personality work, that a person has to undergo in order to be in balance, to be in focus. That you have to constantly work. That a person is a conglomeration of multiple interrelated personality traits, any one of which can kind of go off kilter and pull you aside. I always think of that. I always think of that scene in the book The Cat in the Hat. I'm just trying to see the image if I can't pull it up online here. That scene of The Cat in the Hat. Oh, there it is. Hold on a second. I'm putting it up in the, I have little kids, so they like us to read books. So I just put it up in the chat. If you click on that chat, you'll see that iconic picture of the cat in the hat balancing on a ball, waving a fan with his tail, on one foot balancing a saucer of milk, in one hand an umbrella with a fishbowl on top, a cake on top of his head, a book balanced on the other, all while balancing on a moving ball. That to me, minus the slapstick nature of it, is the picture of what the Rambam is talking about, more explicitly in Hilchot Deot, that the religious life, the purpose of man, is to manage a balancing act, where all of these different components of your life, of your personality, of your intellect, of your interpersonal behavior, of your relationship with God, of your inner kavana, of your outwardly directed the manifestations of your commitment to ritual, everything is kept in balance. But it's not the kind of balance where you take, a large object and it comes to rest, at the bottom of the hill and is therefore stable. It's the kind of balance of, the image of our friend the cat in the hat, where any one thing can go off kilter and send the whole thing crashing down. And the Rambam describes in Hilchot Deot, in the Shmona Prokim, rather, the necessity for this kind of, once you're in balance, there are people who are not in balance, so they have a lot of work. But once you get your act together, there's the constant day in and day out work of fine-tuning it to keep it in balance. I, unfortunately, recently was discussing this with a group of younger folks, younger than us, and I gave a metaphor which I discovered is so completely outdated that no one knew what I was talking about. But I remember as a kid, and I'm sure some of you also do, the old TVs, before cable television, the old TVs, you'd turn on the TV, you'd actually have to get off the couch and turn the dial to the channel that you wanted, and then there was a tuning dial to do the fine tuning. And if something happened, like if my mother turned on the blender in the other room or something, or somebody was using a hair dryer, so then the focus on the TV would go out of whack. It would get all staticky, and you'd have to refocus it. So that's the just to use a metaphor, that's the Rambam is talking about. The day, once you're in balance, once you've tuned into the right channel, you have to constantly be adjusting the antenna or constantly be fiddling with the fine-tuning dial. Otherwise, you're going to go out of focus. You're going to lose the signal, and you'll inevitably come crashing down. So that kind of work, the Rambam says, that's the purpose of man, is to get into balance and to stay into balance. It's like people, right, those old test patterns on the TV. And remember the Emergency Broadcasting Network and all of those good things. And then the Rambam says that Zeh ha'inyan, this matter, lo nada min hanaviim bilvad. This is not something that we know about. This task is not something that we know about through prophecy, bilvad. Ela hachachamim min ha'umot ha'kadmoniot. Even from like natural philosophy, this is something that we can be aware. It's interesting that the Rambam, kind of dismisses prophecy, which for the Rambam is a great matter indeed. He says this is something it's like obvious. You don't need to be a prophet, or you don't need access to prophecy to know this. ומי שלא ראו הנביאים ולא שמעו חכמתם, כבר ידעו זה גם כן, שאין האדם אדם שלם, אלא אם כן יכלול החוכמה והמעשה. A person is not an Adam Shalem. This notion, the Adam Shalem, human perfection, is human perfection. Ezra, I see that Esther's having some trouble. Perhaps you can help her out. human perfection, the idea that we can reach a sense of shleimut, of wholeness, of integrity, of perfection. What the Rambam means by shleimut, we'll have to discuss. But this idea is that it has to do with the integration and the balance between chokhmah and ma'aseh, between wisdom and action. V'day lecha ma'amaro shel hagadol hafilosofia kavanat ha'el banu sheniyeh nivonim v'tovim. Right? He's apparently quoting Aristotle here. It's not exactly clear where he's quoting from. Perhaps it's from this work, the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle had a son called, I think his name was Nicomacheus, or something like that. And Aristotle wrote a book called the Nicomachean Ethics. Ethics, again, in the sense of like we talk about Pirkei Avot, we call it the ethics of the father, the ethics of the fathers. So ethics in the sense of, kind of moral instruction. So perhaps in this section, the Aristotle discusses these ideas. If we have time, we'll come back to that. So kavanat ha'el banu shniyeh nivonim v'tovim. V'zeh she'adam im yeh chacham v'navon u'mvakesh ta'avot. That if a person is smart and insightful, but yet he is concerned with his ta'avot, with his desires, with his appetites, right? If he's driven by his physical self, harei einhu chacham be'emet. So he is not truly wise. Now again, the Rambam is talking about an idea which Chazal talked about, which the Rambam talks about, which the Baal HaTanya talks about, which Reb Chaim Volozhiner talks about, which all great Jewish thinkers from the beginning of time until modernity discuss. This paradox, the paradox of mankind, that we are both, physical and animal, and we are spiritual and godly. Now, very often this discussion takes place using the dichotomies of ruchniut and gashmiut, of spirituality and physicality. The balance between these two, that we are, rooted very much on the ground in the physical world, that we have bellies that need to be filled, we have, a body that gets tired and needs a bed to sleep in, that we desire the embrace of a spouse. These are all things in which motar ha'adam min ha'behema ayin, that we are in many ways no better or worse than animals, without at all going into the discussion of evolution. I always find it remarkable. They say that the DNA of man is closer to that of chimpanzees than the DNA of rats are to mice. Now, I find that very interesting. Now, many people are disturbed by that fact. Many people historically thought that these notions were very threatening to the religious order. I find it to be quite ennobling. I find it to be a deeply religious idea. The fact that apparently we are so closely genetically related to monkeys, to apes, heightens the idea of what we've accomplished as a species. That we who are only slightly more developed than the apes, that we who are only slightly more developed than cockroaches, depending on how you look at it, and yet nevertheless we have produced what we have produced as a species in just a few thousand years, which historically speaking is not so long, highlights it underscores the uniqueness of mankind, the potential of mankind, the spiritual potential of mankind. When you think, on one hand, we've produced a Monet and a Vladimir Horowitz and a Picasso and a Beethoven and a Mozart, on one hand, that we've produced Einsteins and Albert Schweitzers, and then on the other hand, we've also produced, Reb Chaim Brisker and Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, and fill in the blank with the gadol of your choice. That all of these representatives of mankind, both from the secular and from the religious worlds, that's a pretty remarkable accomplishment, given that the difference between us and apes is not that great when looking at it purely from a physical point of view. But when you look at it from a spiritual point of view, when we say motar ha'adam min ha'behema ayin, that the value added of being a human over that of being an animal is infinitesimal, that's talking from the gashmiut perspective. That's talking from the physical perspective. But when you look at it from the spiritual perspective, it looks completely different. From the spiritual perspective, we are but a hairbreadth shy of the angels. We are cosmos more developed, but yet we're trapped down here in the physical world. And this tension, this struggle between the two components, between the upper and the lower, is the description. It's the tale of the challenge of being a human. Now, this distinction between again, classically portrayed as ruchniut and gashmiut, spirituality and physicality, the Rambam does not exactly present it that way. The Rambam presents it as the difference between chokhmah and ma'aseh. But meaning chokhmah, the ability to understand, and ma'aseh, how we act in this world. In this world is a place where we have to make choices, and we have to act, and we have to do things, and that's connected to how we attempt to improve ourselves and improve our personalities. And then he goes on to this discussion of the challenge of doing this despite the fact that we all have to eat lunch, and lunch always seems to get in the way. Lunch always seems to get in the way. Now the Rambam was very much not a ascetic, but yet we can understand why the religious world often has a weakness for asceticism. We can understand why in other religions this becomes a value, that the more removed you are from the physical world, the holier you are. The notion of celibate priests is so far into the Jewish worldview, but I think we can understand. Why a religion might go there. Why, even from the worldview that the Rambam's presenting, somebody might read this and make an assumption that it's better to cut yourself off from the physical. But in fact, we take a different turn, and we say no. We don't reject the fact that we are also animal. We embrace that, and we tame it, and we bring it into control, and we try to channel it in a positive direction. We do not negate it, but we try to harness it and sanctify it. That's the Maimonidean view in a nutshell. There's a discussion about Talmud and Maaseh He makes reference to a Gemara in Kiddushin. There's a discussion about whether study is greater than action. There it's talking, apparently that Gemara is talking about a more specifically a question of, is it better to learn Torah, or is it better to do mitzvot? Is it better to study about davening, or is it better to daven? Now, of course, it's in one of these kind of artificial dichotomies. We know, I mean, the answer is given. The answer is given, mirosh. We know what the conclusion is going to be, but how the Gemara gets to the conclusion is what's interesting. The discussion is, of course, that the conclusion is, of course, Talmud, Gdola Talmud, Talmud mevi l'dei maaseh, that study in some ways is superior, because learning about something is both a value in and of itself, but it's also the precursor to fulfillment, for action, for doing the mitzvah. This is something of a side point, because for the Rambam, maaseh is a larger point. It includes, of course, blowing the shofar and davening and shaking the lulav and eating the matzah, etc., etc., etc. But it also includes the work of the inner work, the work of ben adam la'atzmo, of how a person develops his personality. The Rambam here the Rambam had alluded to this in the part that I skipped. There's a Mishna in Avot. Hu haya omer, ein bur yirechet, that a boor, a kind of unrefined person, cannot be God-fearing, cannot have fear of sin. V'lo am haaretz chasid, and an am haaretz. An am haaretz is generally translated as an ignoramus, somebody who's not learned. So somebody who's an unrefined person cannot have fear of sin, and somebody who's an unlearned person cannot be a chassid, cannot be pious. Here, chassid has nothing to do, of course, with the contemporary notion of chassidim. So the Rambam, in his commentary on the Mishnah, says, Bur, hu asher ein lo chachma velo midot. So these two realms, somebody that has chokhmah, that has wisdom, but somebody that also has midot, somebody that's done the work, the maaseh of personality refined. So that person that can have no fear of sin. The am haaretz, an unlearned person, ein lo ma'ala sichlit. So he's better off. The am haaretz is better off than the bur. Because an am haaretz, he might be a nice guy. He might have good intentions. He might want to do the right thing. He's just not learned. Yesh lo katzat malot hamidot. And he can have good character traits. He's just not learned. And if you're not learned, you're not going to be pious. Because knowledge is a very powerful and transformative factor in life. It's what sets us apart. And if you know something, then that impacts both on your personality and on your ability to do it. But it's possible to not have so much knowledge and to still be a good person. You're just going to make a lot of mistakes along the way. You're going to get a lot of things wrong because you're not going to have, A, the operative knowledge of how to do mitzvot properly, and B, you're not going to have the kind of life knowledge that's necessary to navigate the world, to navigate interpersonal relationships and to make sense of things and to kind of just generally get it right. This section from Aristotle, we're not going to go into it and read it inside, but it might be worth taking a look at. If you're interested in this work, you can, again, the Wikipedia article on the Nicomachean Ethics, if you just Google it, you'll find it. Will give you some interesting background. But the Aristotle discusses, and again, I mention this because the Rambam quotes it. this thing what he calls philosophical wisdom versus practical wisdom, which is a similar kind of dichotomy to what the Rambam is talking about. The Rambam here in the Mor Nevuchim, in the very, very last chapter of the Guide to the Perplexed, the Rambam says the following. It's a parallel source to what we're talking about here, and it's involved in this discussion of the Adam HaShalem. He says that the ancient and modern philosophers have shown that man can acquire 4 kinds of perfection. There are 4 categories of shlemut. So in our text, the Rambam was talking about the Adam HaShalem. In the Mor Nevuchim, the Rambam spells it out in a little greater detail, that there are different types of perfection. There are different types of perfection. The first kind, the lowest, it's a hierarchy, in the acquisition of which people spend their days, is perfection as regards property. One is people want to have things, and it's not unreasonable to want things. The possession of money, garments, furniture, servants, land, and the like. The possession of the title of a great king belongs to this class. There is no close connection between this possession and its possessor. It is perfectly imaginary relation, when on account of the great advantage a person derives from these possessions, he says, this is my house, this is my servant, this is my money, these are my hosts and armies. When he examines himself, he will find that all of these things are external, and their qualities are entirely independent of the possessor. It's a kind of strange notion. It seems very different than what we've been talking about until now. But the lowest level of perfection of shlemut is a sense of you have everything you need. You're a collector, you're a stamp collector. You want the whole album to be full. Whether it's money or it's other possessions, the sense that when you have what you need or what you want, there's difference, of course, so you can be closer or further away from that sense of being full, of having it all. But the Rambam correctly points out that this really has nothing to do with the possessor. That you talk about like, I have it all, but the possession of objects is separate from the personality. Although, obviously, sometimes, a certain type of materialism has a negative effect on a personality, but the possession of the materials themselves are independent. When, therefore, that relation ceases, he has been a great king. He that has been a great king may one morning find that there is no difference between him and the lowest person, and yet no change has taken place. And yet no change has taken place in the things which were ascribed to him. The philosophers have shown that he whose sole aim is all his exertions and endeavors is the possession of this kind of perfection, only seeks perfectly imaginary and transient things, and even if these remain his property all his lifetime, they do not give him any perfection. So this is a very illusory type of sense of having it all, of being perfect. The second kind is more closely related to man's body than the first, and includes the perfection of the shape, constitution, and form of man's body, the utmost evenness of temperaments. Again, for the Rambam, temperament is very much connected to the physical. Remember, they had a notion of humors and your personality being very connected to your physicality. These are notions that went out of fashion. They've come back a little bit into fashion in the medical community. This kind of perfection must likewise be excluded from forming our chief aim, because it is a perfection of the body, and man does not possess it as man, but as a living being. He has this property besides in common with the lowest animal. And even if if a person possesses the greatest possible strength, he cannot be as strong as a mule, for example. Much less can he be as strong as a lion or an elephant. He therefore can, at the utmost, have strength that might enable him to carry a heavy burden, or break a fixed substance, or do similar things in which there is no great profit of the body, for the body. The soul derives no profit whatever from this kind of perfection. So the Rambam he's showing his cards. The soul derives no profit whatever from this kind of perfection. So the Rambam, look, remember the Rambam was a physician, and the Rambam thought that healthy mind, healthy body was the byword of what we ought to do. And he also thought that your physical health was very much connected to your, what we term mental health. The Rambam, of course, didn't use that term. The Rambam talked about your midot, your character traits. But even that is not inherent to who you are. This is, I think I may have mentioned, there's an essay by Rav Aryeh Kaplan. He has a book called, he has a booklet, I think it was put out many years ago by NCSY, called If You Were God. You Google it, you'll find it. You can buy it online. It's worth having. It's a little booklet. I think there's 2 or 3 essays in there. One of the essays there is called The Real You. And it starts off with this little thought experiment where he asks the readers to close their eyes. And why don't you do this now? Close your eyes and point to you. Right? So some people, I'm looking on the cameras, some people, most people intuitively point to their chest, right? And some people point to their head. But neither is really correct. I mean, people that point to their chest, you can open your eyes again. The people that point to their chest, well, that's, like when you point to somebody, that's kind of, I guess, the most, solid part, your thorax. That's, who you are. I don't think as you're pointing to your heart. We have these metaphors. The body parts become metaphorical for, for different traits. And other people point to their head because we have this notion that, inside there, in the gray matter, there's, that's where I am. That's, where, that's where the real me resides. Inside my brain, my personality is inside the hard wiring in my brain. But even that, of course, is not true. So that's part of the that's part of what the Rambam is here saying, that it's true, you need to have a strong, healthy physical body. But having that is also not the highest form of perfection, because it's only one component of you that could be said to be perfect if you're in tip-top physical shape. The third kind of perfection is more closely connected. The third kind of perfection is more closely connected with man himself than the second perfection. It includes moral perfection, the highest degree of excellency in man's character. Most of the precepts aim at producing this perfection. Most of the mitzvot aim at producing this perfection. The Rambam earlier in the Moreh Nevuchim had done this big ivchun, this big attempt to divide, to categorize the mitzvot into mitzvot that are aimed at perfecting the person and mitzvot that are aimed at perfecting society. So the Rambam says that most of the precepts, most of the mitzvot aim at producing this perfection, the perfection of moral perfection. But even this kind is only a preparation for another perfection and is not sought for its own sake. For all moral principles concern the relation of man to his neighbor. The perfection of man's moral principles is, as it were, given to man for the benefit of mankind. Imagine a person being alone and having no connection whatever with other person. All his good moral principles are at rest, meaning they get taken off the table, because moral principles have to do largely, we can think of examples that might be exceptions to this rule, but moral principles have to do with our interaction with other people. And that's what's so fascinating about it. Because as opposed to the mitzvot, the purely normative ritual mitzvot, or mitzvot ben adam lemakom, between man and God, shaking a lulav or mezuzah, it's a very static mitzvah. You put the mezuzah up on the door, it stays there, and you don't have to think about it too much. You've done it, but you don't have to have this ongoing relationship with it, even in the way that you have to have with davening. And when you go in and out of the door, you should. A lot of people have this minhag, they kiss the mezuzah, but that's not really part of the mitzvah. And it's meant to maybe create some kind of consciousness or of holy space or all these other ideas, but that's also not apparently part of the fulfillment of the mitzvah. If you have a kosher mezuzah on the door, you fulfill the mitzvah. But mitzvot ben adam lechavero are different than that, because there are always at least two infinite variables, me and you, and how I feel and how you feel and what situation we're put in and what kind of mood we're both in and how we rub up against each other and how we interact with each other and how I try to anticipate your needs and how you try to anticipate my needs and how we try to be sensitive and responsive to each other. This is the realm of Ben Adam leMakom, Ben Adam lechavero. So if you're Robinson Crusoe and you're alone on an island, it becomes kind of irrelevant. It becomes he says that the principles are at rest; they are not required, and give man no perfection whatever. So every time we interact, it's an attempt to like the Gemara describes chavruta in a completely different context. The Gemara describes chavruta as like two knives sharpening each other. The way you might sharpen one knife on the back of another. That's in terms of kind of intellectual sharpening. But a moral sharpening we have every time we interact. That's what helps us perfect ourselves. That's what helps us improve ourselves. These principles are only necessary and useful when man comes in contact with others. The fourth kind of perfection is the true perfection of man, the ultimate aim. The possession of the highest intellectual faculties, the possession of such notions which lead to true metaphysical opinions as regards to God. Here, ben adam lemakom, but not the fulfillment of the mitzvot ben adam lemakom alone, but a kind of grasping, what the Rambam earlier described as the ability to know to the greatest degree possible that man is able to know God. In the Hilchot Shuvah, the Rambam describes the ways that we come to know God through Torah study, through the encounter with the physical world. Again, that's interesting, the dichotomy between the Ruchani and the physical and the Gashmi, Torah study, and encountering God in the created world. With this perfection, man has obtained his final object. It gives him true human perfection. It remains to him alone. It gives him immortality. How does it give him immortality? Because if one has developed into a sufficient degree that he has a level of God awareness, then he merits Olam Haba. That's what we discussed 2 semesters ago when we discussed the Rambam's Hakdama L'Perek Chelek. And on its account, he is called man. That's what it means to be a man. That's what separates us from the animals. God consciousness. God consciousness. Examine the first 3 kinds of perfection. You will find that if you possess them, they are not your property. All of those earlier possessions, they are michutz lecha. I mean, they might be in your possession, but they're not you. They don't become inherently part of you, the property of others. According to the ordinary view, however, they belong to you and to others. But this last kind of perfection is exclusively yours. No one else owns any part of it. Even the third part, it's a partnership. Your moral knowledge, your moral intelligence, to use the language of a gardener, your moral intelligence is you share in partnership with the society in which you live. Because you need to be part of that society, you need to be part of interacting with other people in order for it to have any meaning. But this fourth category, that's private. Your aim must therefore be to attain this fourth perfection that is exclusively yours, and you ought not to continue to work and weary yourself for the things which belong to others, while neglecting your soul till it has lost entirely its original purity through the dominion of the bodily powers over it. The same idea is expressed in the beginning of those poems, which allegorically is from the state of our soul, in Shir HaShirim. In Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim is a mashal, right? The Song of Songs. The Megillat Shir HaShirim is a metaphor for the relationship between man and God. Also, the following passages first is, okay, I'll skip that. Just 1 second. Okay, anyway, you can read this on. This is only a section of the final chapter of the Moreh Nevuchim. You can get the rest online if it's of interest to you. But for this, the Rambam, again, has come around full circle. The Torah is a blueprint for both negotiating this world and interacting with others in it, but also for mapping out a relationship with God. We know God partially through studying His Torah. It's the fingerprint that He left behind for us, and we can understand Him. By understanding Him, we perfect ourselves, we perfect our intellect, and it is through our intellect, through our ability to think and to reason, that that's what this section is doing here in the discussion of what the Torah is. Because the Rambam has described the Torah is a book. It's an instruction manual for how to live your life. This is how Chazal activated what the Torah Shebechtav was meant. It's like I downloaded a file today to my computer that was zipped. Now I don't know if Ezra's still around. He can explain to us what that means. But as I understand it, it's a way of packaging a very heavy file into a small file, compressing it into a small file so that you can like download it, or you can email it, or something like that. You know, you like cram it all together. And then when it was on my desktop, it said you want to extract these files. So if you click yes, it turns out that instead of one file, it's really like 20 files. And it opens up like a jack-in-the-box. You open it up, and this thing pops out. You didn't realize that that it was all compressed. You didn't realize it was all compressed in there. Or like a toy that my kid got in a cereal box. It looked like a little. It was like a little green dinosaur, like plastic. It was about, I don't know, like 3/4 of an inch big. And you soak it in water overnight, and it must have been some kind of sponge that had been like really, 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 really compressed. And you soak it in water overnight, and in the morning you come, and it's like grown to be like 5 or 6 inches big. That's what Chazal do to the Torah Shebechtav. The Torah Shebechtav is a zipped file, and through the Shloshet Esrei Midot She'Torah Nidreshet Behem, through the other mechanisms that Chazal had, they're able to extract they're able to unzip the Torah. They're able to put it in the water, and it expands to what it really is, to its uncompressed state. But that has an impact on us. That has an impact on us because it's the roadmap, the instruction manual for how we might encounter Hashem. We do that through studying the Torah. We do that through living the Torah. We do that even through interacting with others, from the third level of perfection to get to a fourth level of perfection. And that's what this whole section is doing here in the history of Talmud Torah. Because the history of Talmud Torah is not merely about the black on white instructions. It's about how to add the water and uncompress it and to bring it to life for how to live and how to think and how to be, etc. That's what the Rambam has been doing in this section of the Hakdama, the Perush HaMishnayot. Next week is, depending upon which continent you're in or which country you're in, it is Shavuot, or it's the second day of, it's Yom Tov Sheni of Shavuot on Thursday. So even though I'm teaching right now on Thursday night, for some of you it's still Thursday during the day. So next week it will still be Yom Tov. So we're not going to have Shir. That's the short answer. Next week we won't have the Shiur. We'll continue the following week. But again, I encourage, think a little bit about what we're doing. Download the materials, read them on your own, do a little extra work, review what we've had to say, read your notes, listen to the archive. I remind you that these shiurim, this is not true for all WebYeshiva shiurim. If you go to WebYeshiva.org, WebYeshiva.org, up there in the chat box, you can usually, within a day or so of the class, you can download the MP3, just the recording of the shiur. Usually that's not, and WebYeshiva, usually you only get the whole recording that you have to go into the archives. But this particular class we put up as an MP3, and you can listen to it on your iPod when you peel the potatoes, or when you wash the floor, or when you go for your jog, or when you're sitting and learning your Torah. So you can do that for this particular class to review. So next week, or in 2 weeks from now, when a lot has come and gone in between, including some cheesecake, and I say, hey, what were we talking about? Somebody might actually remember. So I wish you all a Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach, Chag Shavuot Sameach, and remember, Shavuot is about cheesecake, but it's also about Talmud Torah. So you should do a little bit of each. Laila Tov.